Nexus PMG welcomes you to the Bigger Than Us podcast, which we as energy geeks lovingly refer to as the BTU. Bigger Than Us is a podcast that focuses on ideas that will shape the future of our planet and ultimately our existence. We will occasionally lean into energy topics because, after all, it's the key to our collective survival. But we'll also explore other ideas and topics that we believe will have an impact that is bigger than us. And now, on to today's show. Hello, and welcome to the Bigger Than Us podcast. I'm your host, Raj Daniels, and today I'd like to welcome Jeremy McKane to the show. Jeremy McKane is an artist with the passion for the environment. His focus has been directed on ocean issues for several years. He is an active Explorers Club member and the CEO of OCN.ai, also known as Project Ocean, an autonomous network of marine robots that automate enforcement at sea. Jeremy, how are you doing today?
I can't complain. I'm sitting in my house. I'm comfortable. I'm connecting with amazing, wonderful people like yourself from around the world. So it could be worse, and I'm grateful that it isn't.
Well, I appreciate the kindness. And where are you located?
I'm in Dallas, Texas.
Me too. It's a lovely day today, isn't it?
I don't know. I haven't been outside. That's what happens with this COVID situation where we end up working. And then you realize, crap, I haven't actually been outside for a few days.
Well, take my word for it. It's beautiful today. It's very nice.
Well, I will make it a mission to at least venture out. Maybe I will do it after this call.
So, Jeremy, I like to open the show by asking my guest the following question. If you were asked to share something interesting about yourself, what would it be?
I don't know. I guess it depends on what you find interesting. I mean, I think it's also funny because that question I get that question a lot, and what others might find interesting, my wife isn't going to find interesting at all. So it's all a matter of perspective. I don't know. I mean, I think something that I think is interesting is about myself is I really over the last few years have enjoyed working with humpback whales in the wild, and for a number of years, and I've spent filming them. I continually go back because no one has ever documented the birth of a humpback whale. They've gotten close, but not a full birth, and so it's something that I feel like it's a shame that with all the knowledge we have as humans that we don't know more, and so it's one of the things that drives me out there to go continue to try and capture. But I've been in the water with 35, 36 humpbacks at once, and it's just an amazing experience, and it gives you perspective on this planet of really and truly how small you are.
So that is interesting. My kids love watching these wildlife shows on Disney. Whales are one of their favorites. I have never been in and around whales. I've seen this photograph of a kayaker. I think it's somewhere by Seattle. And I don't know what kind of whale it is, but it's a huge whale that's just kind of swimming next to the kayaker. And it kind of freaks me out every time I see it.
Yeah, try being on a surfboard. I mean, it's so funny because it's like, I remember the first time it happened to me. Actually, the first time it wasn't on a surfboard. It was on a kayak. I was in Hawaii, and I just had this massive, what looked like an island coming up. It's just like this right next to me, and and then they disappeared, and that was the part that scared me the most because I was like, well, what if he's going to do a breach and I'm right here? It's amazing what happens inside your brain when you're by yourself and you have no one to talk to, how easily you can freak yourself out. But I will set your mind at ease in explaining that humpback whales and other whales, they're very social creatures. Actually, they have more spindle cells in their prefrontal cortex than we do. So they have a better understanding and dynamic of these social interactions within themselves, but possibly even with us as well. But they consciously decide to get out of our way. They don't want to harm us. It's one of the only animals that I've ever been with that you feel like you are you're connected to something, probably in many ways much greater than you are.
It sounds amazing. Now, how many times have you been around humpback whales?
I've got collectively almost 1,000 hours underwater. I mean, I kind of I lost count after a while, but it's somewhere near 1,000 hours underwater.
That's another thing that bothers me quite a bit is being underwater. I'm happy to jump out of an airplane, but being underwater, being in an environment where I can't breathe has always been a little bit disturbing for me. I did some scuba training many, many years ago, but haven't been back, done some snorkeling a few years ago, but it's something I need to explore further.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I started diving, scuba diving and those kinds of things, and I would say it's funny because I don't actually scuba dive as much as I used to. I practice more free diving, which probably freaks you out even more. That's where you take one breath at the surface and you go down, and when I first started doing it, I could maybe do 20 feet and hold my breath for like a minute. But the longer you practice, the longer you can go, the deeper you can go. And there's an old saying that scuba divers dive to look around and free divers dive to look within. And a lot of that is because when you're down there, you can hear more, you're part of the environment, you get a better understanding for how things really operate in the oceans, but I would say collectively on the planet as a whole.
Well, maybe offline you can give me some tips and pointers about overcoming some of these concerns I have.
I would love to. In fact, I'd love to have you come out to Maui one of these days. I'll show you firsthand.
Appreciate it. So, Jeremy, can you give me an overview of Project Ocean?
Yeah, sure. So, we this is a concept that really involves technology and a little bit of indigenous wisdom. And I say a little bit because I've really just been inspired by some of the things that I've learned. I guess the best way to start would be to talk about the ancient practice of tapu, or as the Fijian language, it's referred to as tambu. Tapu basically means taboo or forbidden. And it was a practice, there's lots of different types of tapus, right? Like there's, you shouldn't walk around naked. That's a tapu, right? But as it relates to, or maybe you couldn't walk around naked. That's your thing. But some other people might say, hey, that's very tapu. Um, but as it relates to ocean conservation, some of these areas were created so that fishermen wouldn't fish. There was a certain reverence that was attached to this. If you pass through a tambu, then a lot of times you have to take your hat off or your sunglasses, or you couldn't speak, or there's just a number of just respect things. And some tambus were created because maybe people died in that spot, and it was something for people to memorialize. Other times, it was the fact that the resources were running low. And the chief would often say, this area is tambu, and no one goes in here, no one goes fishing. And so what they would find is that they would come back a year later, they would count the fish, and then the fish wasn't necessarily where it needed to be. They'd come back the following year, and so on and so forth. Eventually, when there was enough that they couldn't count anymore, then they would release the tambu and go fishing. So it was this interesting kind of balance. And we don't really do that today. We create these marine protected areas, these sanctuaries, and we do amazing work. The scientists that are involved in these are doing phenomenal work, but they're not necessarily in line with some of the ancient practices. And so I thought, well, what if we could somehow bridge that technology, or bridge the technology with some of those ancient practices? So I sat down with probably some of the smartest people that I could find and said, what if we created a network where we could collaborate and share data? Just so it turns out, though, some of the data doesn't really come in the frequency that you would want. I mean, you can access all kinds of data about the ocean, but you might not get it for 6 months. So what we have is a lot of low resolution, low frequency data. And if I, correlate this to, say, your bank account, and you're spending money every single day, but you got a statement once every 6 months, it'd be really hard for you to make any kind of massive adjustments because the frequency in which you're getting your feedback data is really not conducive to actually making hard and fast decisions that could maybe prevent you from bankruptcy in that case. So this is kind of the state of the ocean. We don't have high resolution, high frequency data. And Lord Kelvin is famously quoted by saying that if we were to improve something, we must first measure it. So we want to improve the ocean, we want to improve the health, but we also need to have proper measurement tools and collaboration tools. So what we strive to do is measure the life in the ocean. Is it conducive for life? For one, that's the first step. Are there contaminants or pollutants that are preventing life from taking place in these waters? Second to that, if it is a conducive place for life and longevity, what kind of life is there? Is there tuna? Is there groupers, snappers, sharks, whales? What is it? And then beyond that, what are those lives actually worth? We know what a value of a tuna or a snapper or a grouper is, right? Because that's the kind of thing that we would expect to buy at the market. But how many of the tunas are there? How many of the groupers are there? Well, we just don't know. And this is what brings us to this concept of the tragedy of the commons. We're extracting life in the oceans at unprecedented rates. And how do we really know what's left? Well, we don't. So we set out to say, what if we could build some tools that could examine things? My first thought was, I don't know. Imagine if, we were snorkeling and then we could recognize fish. Could we do that? So we could train machine learning models to be able to recognize certain types of fish and then to count them. So that's one way, but that only works so far because, we can only see what we can see, probably 0 to say 20 feet. Beyond that, it gets a lot more difficult. And here enters into this brave new world, very experimental, of environmental DNA, where we grab water samples and we look for specific genomes of the types of fish that we're looking for. So that's one way that we're being able to do it. And so what that does is it gives us kind of a baseline of what is actually there, and is it increasing or is it decreasing? And so that's one side of what we're doing, and why we're doing it is just to better understand our oceans. I like to look at it a lot like how we acquire data about, Earth and weather systems. You don't hear very many people dying from tornadoes and hurricanes like you did in the early 1900s. And the reason for that is because we have a massive amount of data collection. We have machine learning algorithms that can actively predict storm tracks, and people are getting out of the way, and it's saving lives. So if we were to acquire the same amount of data or more about the oceans, which, by the way, is the final frontier of human understanding, we know more about space than we do our own oceans, then I think we could maybe, prevent some absolutely huge catastrophes from happening, and we could mitigate some of the risks. So that's really one of the major things. And from a business standpoint, it makes value because if all of a sudden I have $100 million worth of fish that are floating around in my waters, and we've been able to measure successfully and manage them successfully, then maybe if we protected it the way that we want to, we could have $1 billion with fish in the next 15 years. But we would never know that if we didn't start measuring appropriately. And so that's really the basis for this. And I would say the final thing that we do is that we've also built in an autonomous enforcement tool. So if, Raj, you decide that you want to come fishing in our sanctuary, we're going to let you know pretty quick. You cannot fish there because it's a sanctuary. But if you decide that you're going to be hard-headed and you're going to continue to fish, we'll let you know that you're under arrest, and the Marine Police or Navy or whoever the authority is in that particular country will soon approach you, and you're going to be boarded. If at that time you decide you want to run, that's probably the worst thing you could do. We will intercept you. We will get in front of the bow of your boat, and we will release a propulsion system. Basically, it's a prop fowler, but it will completely destroy your propulsion system. And the only way for you to fix it is to dive down and unmangle this horrible tangled weave of Kevlar cables that we've just wrapped around your props, or entangled into your jet propeller. So this gives the ability for the authorities to approach you, arrest you. And in some countries that we're working with, they will sink your boat on the spot. So you don't want to run from us.
So several questions. Start with the first one. How do you collect the data? And feel free to get as technical as you need to, because I know the audience will appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. So the first thing that we wanted to do is we wanted to grab what's the cheapest way to get data? So I started looking at Raspberry Pis because they seem to be pretty accessible. They're pretty inexpensive. And I kind of like the DIY kind of element to it. So we started, saying, well, what sensors are, over the counter available for the Raspberry Pi? Well, you can get temperature sensors and you can get pH sensors and all these kinds of things. The question becomes, are they scientifically valid? And these are some of the things that we're continuing to kind of verify, and is one sensor equivalent to the next sensor? These are some of the problems. But what we can do is we can still get enough information to better understand more than what we do now, which is nothing. Having a sensor in a place, regardless of how scientific it is or isn't, doesn't matter when you're not doing anything at the present. You can only go up from there. So using platforms like that, I think, is really cool. And then we've also started looking into, basically 3D printing these buoy systems that can be printed with algae, which is pretty cool. So we can provide the STL files. We can provide the ISO for a particular type of buoy, depending on the type of configuration you have. And the cool part about this is that, like if you think of like a Bitcoin transaction, right? If you think about what is Bitcoin mining, well, Bitcoin mining is essentially a game. It's a computer game. And whoever can divide the fastest is the one that's rewarded based on, how much computing power that you put into a pool. I think this problem is kind of stupid, really. I think it's because it's such a huge waste of not only computing power, but really human innovation. I mean, I think cryptocurrencies and the transactions and what they represent themselves is actually pretty ingenious. But the way that we've got this thing, it's like, it's a bit of a waste. And so I thought, well, instead of having that waste where we're running these stupid algorithms, what if we collected data, and just like in Bitcoin mining, where you contribute so much computing power to the pool is, equivalent of how quickly you're going to get paid back for finding the block. What if you were to collect data from the ocean and contribute to the pool of knowledge? And when this data is then paid for by a number of different agencies, academia, private sector, then you got paid based on the amount that you contributed to the pool. To me, this seems like a much more viable use for blockchain technology than maybe some of the ways that we're using it now. So that's one way. The other way is we've built our own systems that are capable of carrying your scientific sensors that you probably would see on an expedition. And so initially I thought, well, it would be really cool to take these things and send them out unmanned. And where I think this is of value is that whenever you have these kinds of missions that you're trying to do scientifically through whatever university, there's grants, there's scientists, there's people that need to be on a boat, there's fuel, there's food that needs to be sent to these people so they can not starve to death while they're out at sea. There's just a lot of expense. Well, what if we could put that sensor on an autonomous vessel that could move periodically wherever you needed it to the study? And better yet, what if Harvard used it today, but tomorrow MIT earmarked it, and Woods Hole used it the day after? We would be using the same sensor, not having to buy it 3 times, doing the same amount of work without having to go through. So it's a lot like time sharing on a satellite. So that's one way we're going to be collecting data. And the other way, I think, is just by observation. We're looking at also putting sensors on various boats. So as fishermen go out and they work in these areas, then we're collecting a number of different data sets for them. And then when it comes back into the visualization of this data, we're working with a couple different companies to come up with ways to really visualize this in a 3D space. Because I feel like if you acquire data from a 3D plane, then you should be able to distribute it in a 3D plane, because that's how we understand things as humans. Our brains work in very spatial environments. It's the same reason why you can listen to a podcast and probably retain more, because as you're listening to this podcast, you're probably looking around at things in a geospatial setting. And later on, you might be in the same exact geospatial setting, and you might remember these very things that I'm talking about right now, whereas you might be on a Zoom call staring at a 2D screen, and you might not remember the context necessarily as much as you would in this way. So we think making the tools better for humans to really conceptualize and feel what's happening is a better way to kind of mitigate potential threats. And so those are just some of the ways that we're collecting data, and we're all in constant exploration mode of different types of systems that we could do. Of course, there's also tons of data that's currently being collected by the ocean. There's Global Fishing Watch as an example, who provides a free API. There's the Argos Float Network, and we're tapping into all those systems.
So when you said time sharing on a satellite, is exactly what I was thinking about when you were speaking about the different organizations you're talking to,
Yeah.
almost renting time on your buoy. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's you were like the Uber for scientific sensors, basically, at that point.
And so you mentioned the blockchain model earlier. In my mind, it's kind of like crowdsourcing data. So
Yeah.
are you collecting data yourself and also from other parties too? And you mentioned the other organizations, but other individuals?
Yeah, I mean, so like if you decided that you had a house on the beach and you want to just record some kind of data and contribute to the project, you could do that, and we could give you the tools to make that happen. So I think it's really interesting because when I was in Fiji, one of the chiefs had asked me to explain blockchain to him, and I was thinking to myself, well, how do you explain? I don't know if the guy had a computer or not, but let's assume that he didn't. Like, how do you explain blockchain to a guy that doesn't have a computer? So I said to him, I said, well, we sit around the kava circle and we learn about each other. And then if I promise that I'm going to do something in the kava circle when the whole village is here to hear me, but later I come back and say, no, I never said that. I'm not going to do that. What would happen? And he's like, well, if the whole village would say, no, I heard you say that. And I said, well, that's blockchain. Basically, I say I'm going to send a Bitcoin to somebody, and then another machine kind of verifies it and confirms it. Another one confirms it. When I get 3 confirmations, then the transaction is almost done. That means it gets confirmed at that point. But then by the time that I maybe use that Bitcoin, there's hundreds of thousands of machines globally that have confirmed that and written it into their ledger. I said that's what we need to do with ocean data. If the temperature is 22 degrees and there's 5 other buoys that are right around it that say it's also 22 degrees, well, then it must be 22 degrees. And this provides kind of it really, for me, even before all this crypto nonsense happened where people were going crazy, blockchain always to me was a symbol of truth, because that's what happens. It's like when we go meet somebody, like, I met this guy named Raj. He's got this podcast. He's a nice guy. He seems cool. Hey, what do you think about it? Oh, no, Raj is a good guy. Oh, yeah, Raj is a good guy. So I'm only to deduce the fact that Raj is a good guy. And that's how we operate as humans. And I think having something like this in a digital format will really help us get to the next level when truly understanding what the ocean has in store for the next revolution. And I think we're heading in towards, we had the Industrial Revolution, we had the Digital Revolution, but we are on the cusp of a new blue revolution. And this blue economy, I think, is going to really be something amazing in the next 10 years.
Yeah, I agree. And consensus is one of the key pillars, I know, of blockchain and cryptocurrency. So understand what you're saying there. So, Jeremy, I'm going to switch gears here. The crux of our conversation is the why behind what you do. It's obvious from your experience. You mentioned swimming with the whales and 1,000 hours underwater experience, but why Project Ocean? Why now?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because it's like everything has kind of come from art. It's a great question, and thank you for phrasing it that way. Because what I have found is that I've had art installations that have exhibited around the world. One of them was called Lucid. It was part of the Ocean Plastics Lab. It was part of a commitment to the G7 and paid for by the German ministry. And it was an installation where we would show, just plastic trash, stuff that I had filmed from around the world. And we used a neurofeedback headset. And when you were to clear your mind and not be distracted, we would basically measure the way that your brain was operating in real time. And if you could be present and you weren't being distracted and being constantly switching every 5 seconds, we would rate you on a score. If you hit 60% of our score, then we would reward you with these beautiful things in the ocean that need protecting. As this thing traveled the world for 3 years, I got some amazing feedback from people, and people saying, "Wow, this is crazy! I didn't realize this was a big deal. We should do something." And so I would get questions like, "Well, what can I do? What's the one thing that I can do?" And I used to dread that question because I didn't really have a great way to answer that. And now I come back with, "Well, I don't know who you are. And I don't know what your superpower is, but whatever you're really good at, I think you need to focus that on this." And that's a much better way of kind of pushing this. Well, I try to kind of retrospectively look back at myself and well, what am I really doing here other than exacerbating this particular issue and putting salt in the wound, I realized that, yeah, although it's great to create awareness about these issues, about the ocean and what needs to be done, it's more impactful to do something. So, but these things are intrinsically connected. You can't have one without the other. So I'm still very heavy in the art world. I still focus on ocean issues, but I created this project because I felt that it was an answer to what everyone was saying. Everyone kept saying, we really need to have a collaboration tool where we can share ocean data. Well, check that box. Cool, we got that. And then we were like, well, we can't afford to, enforce our waters because we don't even have a Navy. We have one boat and we can't afford gas. Okay, well, we figured out how to do it for fractions of the cost. So check that box. And then, we're like, well, we're overfishing and we don't even know what's going to happen. We can't catch fish for our own locals. And, we need to figure out, what we have in our waters. Okay, check that box. So for me, it seemed like there was a vacuum of innovation in the ocean space. And there seemed to be like ingredients, right? Like going to the grocery store, telling yourself, I need to bake a cake. Well, you don't bake a cake by talking about it. You go to the grocery store and you get the ingredients. And in my case, the ingredients were some of the smartest people that I know saying, hey, could you do this part? Hey, could you do this part? And, eventually you leave the place with enough ingredients. And now you got to go do the work. And, we didn't raise any money. We basically put resources together. All of us, some of us wrote code. I spent time working on relationships. Some of us built the actual hardware to build the drones, built the software to autonomously do all these functions that we're talking about today. And then at the end of the day, we ended up with actually a product that not only works, it was funded by blood, sweat, and tears. And now that we have potential clients on the horizon, we are in our seed round. But I didn't want to go through the seed process and say, well, here's this idea that we have, because I'm a strong believer that every one of your ideas is worth absolutely nothing. I mean, if my idea was worth something, then I had invented the iPhone years before it was ever there, but I never did anything about it. So therefore, I didn't do anything. I didn't deserve it. So I believe your execution is really where your value is. And so we wanted to execute before we could ever ask for investment dollars. But now we're in that spot, and I'm really excited about it. We've received a lot of really great responses, but I think that response is a direct response to your question of why now. Why now is because people, probably more than any time in human history, realize the need for change. We have more humans on the planet than we've ever had, and we're operating the same way, status quo, just like we have for thousands and thousands of years. And if it's not broke, you don't fix it. But unfortunately, it's broke, and we have to fix it. And we hope that this could potentially be part of the solution.
So far on this journey, what are some of the most valuable lessons that you'd say you've learned about yourself?
I seem to be really good at getting people to get along, which is odd. I get frustrated with people very easily because I feel like, they can be very short-sighted. But instead of, beating them up and saying, hey, stop doing this stupid thing, generally I've somehow stepped into this role of kind of like being the middleman and saying, hey, this person really wants this. Hey, this person really wants this. Could we find a golden thread that unites us all, and let's just focus on that. I think that's one of the reasons why, Susie and we founded Ultramarine on Sir Richard Branson's Necker Island for that very reason. We thought there's a lot of people here that have a lot of opposing views, but there's some united ideas that kind of link us all together. So let's just all get on an island and let's lock ourselves in a room, basically, and let's see if we can solve some of the world's greatest problems with the resources that we have.
So before I move on, I want to go back to that prop fowler for a moment.
Sure.
In my mind, I'm imagining, an autonomous vehicle, a boat of some kind, and I'm imagining a harpoon or something like that coming out and wrapping up a prop. Can you tell me if I'm correct or if I'm crazy?
That actually sounds a lot cooler than the way that it actually is. Imagine if you're following a boat and all of a sudden you it started growing long hair. And there's this, all of these threads that somehow go underneath your boat and just tangle the crap out of your props. That's essentially how this thing works. And we're also looking at other ways to disable vessels at sea, because we're not some random company. We're actually working underneath the arm of a sovereign nation. So we have a little bit more liberty that we can operate under. And the other thing is that this is a fully collaborative system. So I think gone are the days where the country says, Jeremy, come on over here and help us with this project. And I come down there and plant a bunch of people that are not from there. I'm actually very much against that model. And I'm looking for ways to kind of include locals, to train them, hire local, and then operate local. And I feel like, once we all not only are educated on how these things work and why we need to do them, then it's more impactful that way. And when you get stopped by one of these things, it's really more an extension of that local brand, and not just some guy from Texas that's dropping these things everywhere. But yeah, to answer your question, there's these strands of Kevlar and carbon fiber basically that go underneath the hull of the boat, and the props basically suck them in. And if you have a jet boat, then it goes inside the interprop.
It sounds like a mess for the owner to clean up.
But you kind of get what you deserve. You shouldn't have been there in the first place, and you shouldn't have ran.
Absolutely. So, Jeremy, it's 2025. What does the future hold for Project Ocean?
Yeah, I think we are looking at a number of really amazing things. I think, right now we're really focused on what's going to happen with the blue economy. And I think when you think of the blue economy now, or when you talk to a lot of people, they talk about the exploitation of the ocean, whereas we focus on the exploration of the ocean. And I think this is the UN Decade of Oceans, as you're probably well aware. And, come 2025, we hope to have a significant number of countries on board with what we're doing. And I really hope that we can, while we're protecting it, we're also learning a lot more. I think that right now we are in a very infantile kind of setting where we barely understand the ocean, what's in the ocean, and how to coexist with it. And I'm hoping with using our technology alongside scientists like Dr. Peter Gerges at Harvard University and others, we can really start to have a better sense of what we've been doing wrong for so long and how we can mitigate those threats.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. And before I get to my last question, I was reading your website earlier today, and one of the paragraphs stood out to me. It says, 2 out of every 3 breaths we take comes from the ocean. Can you expand on that, please?
Sure. So there's these little beautiful. There's 2 things that kind of make that happen. There's the bacteria known as Prochlorococcus, and and then there's little carbon-based life forms called coccolithophores. And so what's really interesting about these little guys is that they feed on different things in the ocean. Take for example whale poop. Whale poop feeds Prochlorococcus, and through photosynthesis, more than every second breath of air comes, and that's what we're using right now. So whether you live in Dallas, whether you live in Hawaii, or whether you live in the middle of Siberia, you take that breath, you take another breath, and that second breath most likely is coming from the ocean. And this is an example of how we really take the ocean for granted. And, when you ask, why am I doing this? Well, I don't want us to think of each other, it's fine that we have our own countries. It's fine that we have our own cultures. Great. Awesome. But when it comes to these particular issues, we need to realize that we're one human family. We're consuming the same resources, and we're not in a country. We're not in a town. We're on Spaceship Earth, and our life support system is the ocean. And without the ocean, there is no life. I mean, it's like you were talking about being afraid of not breathing underwater. I'm more afraid of not breathing on this planet. And I think that's the reason why we need to fight like this. As Dr. Sylvia Earle says, we need to fight like our lives depend on it. Well, because they do.
Well, Jeremy, that leads beautifully into my last question, which is, if you could share some advice or words of wisdom with the audience, what would it be?
Yeah, okay. I would say, all of us, we like to point fingers, right? We like to say, oh man, the Chinese, they're just raping our oceans right now. We like to point at other countries and saying, well, they've done this, or maybe even our neighbors. They've done this, they've done that. At our core, we have to realize as humans, we all have the same needs and desires, right? We want to make sure that our bellies are fed. We want to have shelter. We don't want to have to worry about where money is coming from. We want to make sure that our children aren't starving, that they can get education. And we put all of these things in perspective, and we realize that, yeah, your day is busy. You've got lots of things on your plate. Maybe your kids need to be fed. The bath time's coming up. You got to tuck them in bed and then somehow find a way to work in the middle of all this stuff. Sure, your life is busy. But as Ferris Bueller once said, if you don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it. What I ask everyone to do is just take a moment. Book at least, 30 minutes out of your day to stop and look around and think about this. Sure, the Chinese are sending massive fleets all over the world to just take tons of fish out of the ocean, but they also have a huge population. They don't want their children hungry either. We all have the same basic needs. We need to figure out how to stop, look around, and try to figure out what that common thread is so that we can all get the things that we need. I mean, after all, that's what negotiation is. Negotiation isn't about getting what you want. Negotiation is about getting what each other needs. And I think we need to do more of that instead of pointing fingers.
Love that idea. Stop pointing fingers. Everyone get involved together. Jeremy, this has been a great conversation. Is there something that I have not explored or haven't asked you about that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I would just like to share with the audience the fact that if they have some crazy idea and say, hey, look, you know what? I have this cool technology that I think could be used for the ocean, or I have a big pile of money that I want to fund somebody doing something cool for the ocean, or hey, I just want to be more involved in ocean issues. I would encourage you to go to ultramarine-ocean.com. This is an event that I host and I co-founded along with my co-founder, Susie Mai, on Sir Richard Branson's Necker Island. We meet every year where there's a physical and a virtual component. And it might sound super exclusive, but our mission is to be probably one of the most inclusive groups on the planet when it comes to ocean, and to be able to syndicate what everyone's doing so that, every voice is heard. And this is a project that's very near and dear to my heart. And I believe that it's a project that can make real change for the oceans.
I will put a link to that in the show notes, Jeremy, and I look forward to catching up with you again soon.
Raj, thank you for having me on your show. This has been such a great opportunity, and I really love what you're doing here, so thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Before we go, I'm excited to share that we've launched our comic strip, The Adventures of Mira and Nexi. You can find the first issue at our website, nexuspmg.com, under the Original Content tab. Thank you for listening. If you like our show, please give us a rating and review on iTunes. And you can show your support by sharing our show with a friend or reach out to us on social media, where you'll find us under our Nexus PMG handle. If there's a subject or topic you'd like to hear about, send me an email, btu@nexuspmg.com, or contact me via our website, nexuspmg.com. And while you're there, you can sign up for our monthly newsletter, where we share what we're reading and thinking about in the clean tech, green tech sectors. Bigger Than Us is a Nexus PMG production.